And now we turn to Daf Ayin Gimel Amid Beis to continue our study of the Mishnah Bikurim. Ochlan bitumas atman. If a person eats the peros of either Masechet or Bikurim and he's in a state of Tumah, well, actually it says Ochlan bitumas atman, means that he's tar, atzman, meaning the peros atmeim, loka, he gets malchus. Masha ein came with truma. In the case of truma, number one, there's no iser to burn truma tmeya and to benefit from the light, which means that tuma, in the case of truma, is matir havara, burning it. And furthermore, if you eat the truma when the truma is tmeya, you don't get malchus for that. Now, why don't you get malchus for that? He says it's an iser aseh, not an iser los aseh. And the Gemara is going to explain this later on. And we should not confuse this case with the reverse case, where the truma itself is tahora and he's tameh, the gaver is tameh, because in that case he gets malchus. If a tameh eats truma tahora, he gets malchus. But we're talking about the case where the truma contracted tumah, and then the halacha is that if he eats the truma tmeya, he doesn't get malchus. It's only a violation of an essay, as we'll explain later on. But these halachas lo kitani, they don't appear in the Mishnah, Alma Tani V'Shir. So we see that the Mishnah is operating with the principle of Tani V'Shir. And therefore, you wanted to prove from the omission of Arel, Asur, B'Truma, Ubikurim, Umutar, B'Vaiser Sheni, that obviously, just like an oral is excluded from Truma and Bikur, he's also likewise excluded from Masechet. And that you wanted to prove from the omission of the Mishnah. No proof whatsoever. It really could be very well that an oral is allowed to eat Masechet, and we don't derive that from Pesach. The Mishnah omitted it. The Mishnah omitted many things. Now the Gemara wants to bring sources for that which we learned in this Mishnah. For example, the Mishnah says with regard to Bikurim, Asurim li onen v'Rabbi Shimon mati. Minolahu, from whence do the Chachamim derive the conclusion that an onen is not allowed to eat Bikurim? Dichsiv, in the parsha of Masechet, the Torah mentions Bikurim. Lo sucha lechol b'sharecha maser degoncha v'siroscha v'yitzarecha. All this is referring to Masechet. And then it says, u'srumas yodecha. What is srumas yodecha? Omar Mar, this is a sugya in Makis Daf Yud Zayin, srumas yodecha elu Bikurim. So the pasuk is telling me that you're not allowed to eat Bikurim outside of Yerushalayim b'sharecha, but rather you have to bring the Bikurim to Yerushalayim. And how do we know that the Torah here is referring to Bikurim? Because in the Pasha Bikurim in Kitavo that we mentioned earlier, it says V'samta b'tenav alachta, that you have to bring Bikurim to Yerushalayim. So therefore, when it says in the Pasha Masechet, Lo sucha lechol b'sharecha, and then it adds utrumas yodecha, it's logical to assume that that's a reference to Bikurim. Trumas yodecha elu Bikurim. So now we have in the parsha of Masechet, which is in the 12th chapter of Devarim, we have an equation, what we call a hekesh, between Masechet and Bikurim. What do we derive from this hekesh? That's going to be the Isra Onen. Iskish Bikurim l'Masechet. Ma Masechet also onen af bikurim asur lionen. Now the Mishnah records a dissenting view of Rabbi Shimon. He allows an onen to eat bikurim. Rabbi Shimon, who allows an onen to eat bikurim, how does he come to that conclusion? Truma karina rachmana. Although I admit that the Torah does seem to equate Truma with Maser Sheni, but there's another equation. And that's Truma and Bikurim. In other words, if I can draw like a little bit of a map here, we have Maser Sheni on the top right, we have Truma on the top left, and we have Bikurim on the bottom middle. And the question is, where do we draw the connection, the line? Are we going to equate Bikurim with Maser Sheni or Bikurim with Truma? And then Afkamina is going to be Onen. If we equate Bikurim with Maser Sheni, then just like the Torah says explicitly that an Onen is excluded from Maser Sheni, likewise, he's excluded from Bikurim. But if, on the other hand, I equate Bikurim to Truma, an Onen is allowed to eat Truma, hence an Onen would allow to eat Bikurim, and that's the machlokus between the Tanna Kama and Rabbi Shimon. The Tanna Kama understood that there's an equation between Bikurim and Maser Sheni through the pasuk Trumas Yodecha, which is Elu HaBikurim in the Parsha Maser Sheni. There, hence, an Onen is excluded from eating Bikurim. However, Rabbi Shimon has a different connection in which he connects Bikurim to Truma. Because Truma Karina Rachmana, the Torah calls Bikurim Truma, as it says, Utrumas Yadecha Elu Bikurim. Ma Truma Mutil Lionein, Af Bikurim Mutil Lionein. Next, Chayovim v'Chayovim b'Bir. The Mishnah says that according to the Tanna Kama, Maser Sheni and Bikurim both require Bir. And we're going to implement the equation between Bikurim and Maser Sheni, that just like Maser Sheni requires Bir, so to Bikurim require Bir. Rabbi Shimon Poter. Mar, according to the Tanna Kama, Makish, we have a hekish between Bikurim and Maser Sheni. Umar, but Rabbi Shimon lo Makish, he doesn't have a hekish between Bikurim and Maser Sheni, because he understands that the Trumas Yodcha in the Parsha Maser Sheni is a reference to Truma, and it's equating Bikurim with Truma. And just like in Truma, there's no such thing as Vidui. There's no such thing as Biur. There's no mitzvah Biur in Truma. There's only a mitzvah Biur in Maser Sheni. Therefore, Bikurim, insofar as it is Truma, does not generate a chiyuv of Biur. Next, the Asur Levar Mehen Bituma. You're not allowed to benefit from the ner that's made of Shemen, Shal Maser Sheni, or Shal Bikurim Shenitmu. The Ochlon Bitumas Atzmon, Loke. And if the peiros contracted Tuma and he's tar, and he eats these peiros of Maser Sheni or Bikurim, he incurs a chiyuv malchus. Minolan, how do we know this? The Sanya of Shimon Omer. With regard to Vidu Maser Sheni, the Torah says that you declare lo bi'arti v'menu b'tameh, and it means I didn't burn Maser b'tuma to use it for the purpose of lighting my candles or cooking my food. Is bein shani tameh mutar, bein shani tar mutameh. In both cases, I violate the Isur Lav of lo bi'arti v'menu b'tameh. So when a Vida says that not enough that my Maser Sheni was tar, and I didn't burn Maser Sheni chas v'shalom, but moreover, even if my Maser Sheni contracted Tumah, still lo bi'arti v'menu b'tameh. And we see a big chiddush, as we indicated earlier, that even Masechet, which does not lend itself to achila shesiya or sicha, because it's already contracted tumah, nevertheless, a tar is not allowed to be madlik this Meiser Sheni Shenitma, or in this case, not only Meiser Sheni, but also Bikurim. Right, that's why it says also levar mehen bituma in the plural, referring not only to Meiser Sheni, but also Bikurim. Is you're not allowed to be Mavir Mehem B'Tumah. Now we have a losaseh on Achilas Meiser Sheni B'Tumah. And now we're flipping it around. Until now, we were discussing a case of Meiser Sheni or Bikurim that contracted Tumah, and he's tar. Now we switch it around. And we're talking about a case of Ani tar v'hu tameh, Ani tameh v'hu tar. Heichan muzar al achilos. How do we know that a tameh violates a losas if he eats Meiser Sheni while he's tameh, which is called tumas gufo? And Reb Shimon says, Eini yodea. I don't know the answer to that question. I don't have a source for the Isur Losas in Tumas Gufo if he eats Meiser Sheni B'Tara and he's Tomei. So at this point, the Gemara kind of takes an interlude, a break, and it asks about Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon is wondering, where do I find the source for the Isur Losas of a Tomei who's Tomei B'Gufo if he eats Meiser Sheni B'Tara? So the Gemara immediately asks, Tumas Haguf Behedjik Zivbe. Well, why would Rabbi Shimon say Lo Eini Odea? It's explicit in the Torah. The Torah says in Vayikra Perkov Beis, Nefesh Asher Tiga Bo Vitama Ana Orev. It means that if a person contracted tumah, let's say he had contact with the sheretz, lo yochal min hakodshim, ki im rochatz b'soro b'mayim. So there's a losase here of lo yochal in a case of a tamei tumas guf, and he's eating Meiser Sheni. So again, we're trying to figure out why Reb Shimon said Eini Yodea. I don't have a source for a tamei who's eating Meiser Sheni B'Tara. The Gemara says, Hachi Moboile. This is what Rabbi Shimon was wondering about. Tumas Atzman. If the peiros of Meiser Sheni themselves contracted tumah, minayin, how do I know that he who eats the peiros is in violation of a lotas? And on that, the Brisa quotes Talmud Lomer Lo Sucha Lechel B'Sharecha Maser Degoncha, which is a reference to Meiser Sheni, Ula Halon. And later on in the parsha, the Torah addresses the case of Kodshim Shenofal Bohem Mum, which is called Psulei Hamukdashim, in which you have to be poda them and redeem them onto another animal and bring that other animal that's a tamim onto the mizbeach. And as a result of this pigeon, the original mukdashim that now are psulim lower the level of kedusha. They go down in a madriga through the action of pigeon. So what does it say in the parsha of Psulei Mukdashim after Pidyon? A zar is allowed to eat that that the meat of that behemoth, of that animal, and who omer b'sharecha tochlenu hatome v'ator yachtov katzvi v'kayal. This is in the 15th chapter of Dvarim. I think it's Parshas Re'eh, if I remember correctly. Under Rabbi Yishmael interprets this pasuk, afilu tome v'tar ochlem al shulchan echad b'kara achas. So you have both a tummy and a tar that are eating on one table, even from one bowl, and they're eating basar psulia mikdashim v'einin chosheshin. We're not afraid that the tummy is going to touch the basar and be mitami the basar, which would mean that they're eating psulia mikdashim shenitmu. And the answer is because ein iser la'ochlam b'tumah. There's no prohibition against eating them b'tumah. U'ka'amar rachmana. And in the pasuk beforehand, l'gabi Ma'aser Sheni, it says lo suka lechal b'sharecha. And in what situation are you enjoined from eating Ma'aser Sheni b'sharecha? Ahu di amri lachasam. That's what the Torah indicates at the end of the pasuk with regard to psulim mikdashim b'sharecha tochlenu. That means you're allowed to eat psulim mikdashim tamei v'tar b'kara achas. Is hacha here too in Ma'aser Sheni lo techol. Notice the tamei is mitami the peiros of Ma'aser Sheni, and the tar is now going to eat Ma'aser Sheni b'tumah. And the person who eats Ma'aser Sheni b'tumah violates the Iser Losas of Lo Suchal Lechal B'Sharech. Now, we said that you're not allowed to be Mavayer Ma'aser Sheni B'Kurim b'tumah. Masha Ein came b'Truma. There's no Iser Havara b'Truma. If you have Truma Shenitmeis and you want to light a ner, you're allowed to do so. And the Gemara says, Minolan. The Torah says in Ma'aser Sheni, Lo bi'arti mimeni b'tameh. Mimenu b'tameh, the word mimenu is an extra word. Why did the Torah add the word mimenu? Mimenu yatam mavir, aval atam mavir shemen shel truma shenitma. So it's a mute from the word mimenu, and it sets up a contrast between Truma and Ma'aser Sheni with regard to Nitmeis and Havara. The Gemara asks, how do you know that Mimenu is coming to be Matir Bir B'Tumah? In the case of Truma, the aim of perhaps we could be sticky about it, argumentative about it, say mimenu yato mavir, avlato mavir shemen shel kodesh nitma. Maybe if you have, let's say, for example, in minachos, right? So you magdish the shemen liminachos, and that you're allowed to be mavir b'tumah. You know, it's even if the shemen contracted tumah and it was designated for the mizbeach, you're allowed to burn it. But maybe shemen shel truma shenitma is also bavor like Ma'aser Sheni, and the Gemara says that's impossible. That's an untenable position. You can't be machmir in Ma'aser Sheni and make it in kodesh, in kodshim. Lav kal v'chomer. Certainly, a shemen shel kodesh would be osur b'bir ma maser akal. That means there's an Isur lahaviro b'tumah is kodesh, which is more chamur, lo kolshkein. Certainly, it's also b'bir b'tumah, and therefore it's not possible to say that this pasuk that teaches us that there's no Isur in another case of Bir B'Tumah, it's coming to teach you that Shemen Shel Kodesh. certainly is coming to set up a special halacha in Truma with regard to Shemen Shel Truma, that aval atam ma'avir b'Shemen Shel Truma. Now, I'm not sure if this halach of Shemen Shel Truma is only a heter or it's also a chiyuv and a mitzvah. The Gemara says, hachi, if you're rejecting the possibility that mimenu is coming to be my kodshim because you're kal v'chomer, is Truma nami kal v'chomer? How can you possibly learn from mimenu that you're allowed to be nene from Truma Tmeya behavara? I'm going to conclude from a kal v'chomer that Truma Tmeya is also behavara, because Truma is more chomer than Masechet in many, many different ways. And if in Masechet we said that if the Maser contracts Tuma, it's also have behavara b'Tuma, how much more so in the case of Truma, which is a greater kedusha than that of Masechet? And the Gemara answers, no, we cannot accept this kal v'chomer or ksiv mimenu, because the Torah says mimenu, which means it's mutter to be mavar b'tuma. So the Gemara asks, Umara Isa, what's your svara to say that the Torah is being makil in Truma and not in kodshim? Maybe we should say the opposite, that maybe the Torah is coming to be makil in kodshim, but not in Truma. And the Gemara answers, Mistabra Kodesh lo mima'atina. Kodesh is more chomer than Truma in many, many different ways. And therefore, if the Torah is coming through the word mimenu to allow you to benefit from, let's say, either kodshim or Truma shenitmu, it would make more sense to say that this leniency applies to Truma than to kodshim. Shekain, what are the list of chumras that apply to kodshim that don't apply to Truma? Panka akas, pigul, nosar, Korban, Me'ila, Kares, Osulione. Let's go over some of these chumras. For example, there's an Iser Kares in Pigul, and that applies to Kodshim. There's no din of Pigul in Truma, or Nosa. There's no din of Nosar in Truma. And of course, Kodshim is a Korban that we have to bring inside the Azara, which is not true for Truma. And there's Me'ila. If you are Nenem in HaKodshim, B'Shogeg, you chayav Me'ila. And you have to bring a separate Korban Me'ila. That doesn't apply to Truma. And if you eat Kodshim and your tummy B'Tumas HaGuf, it's a Chiyuv Kares. And there's an Iser Onin. But in Truma, none of these dinim apply. There's no Pigul, there's no Noser, there's no Tu'una V'Ala Migdash, there's no Me'ila, and there's no Chiyuv Kares for eating it B'Tumas HaGuf. I mean, here you have to get into a whole other sugya, which is more Chomer, Misa B'Dei Shamayim in the case of Truma, or Misa, or Chiyuv Kares in the case of Kodshim. This Gemara is assuming without hands down that Kares is more Chomer than Misa B'Dei Shamayim. Whereas Adarab, Truma lo memata, we have a bunch of chumras in Truma that don't apply to Kodshim. Shekain machfaz. What's machfaz? Misa, if you eat it b'tumas haguf, because the pasuk says vayikra chav beis hu mesu bo ki chalaluhu, whereas an ochel kodshim b'tumas haguf, he's not chayiv misa, but he's only chayiv kares. So again, we get into this whole discussion about comparing kares to misa. The chomesh, right? If a zar eats truma, he not only pays the value of the truma, he adds 20%, which we don't find in kodshim. V'ein lo pidon, you cannot be poda truma and transfer its kedusha to something else. Aval kodesh yesh pidon, Rashi says, ad shelo kidesh bekli. So for that, we have to really learn a lot about kachim. In any event, asur is zarim. Right? There's no zarus in shlamim, let's say, for example. So when it says hanach nefishin, we have more chumras on the kachim side vis-a-vis truma than on the truma side vis-a-vis kachim. Another answer is ibay semakari sadifa. That we're going to insist, as we mentioned before, that karis is more chomer than a chiv misa b'dei shamayim. So someone who eats kachim b'tumas haguf, he's chayiv karis. If somebody eats truma b'tumas haguf, he's only chayiv misa b'dei shamayim. So it's more logical to assume that when the Torah comes to be matir havara b'tuma, it's a reference to truma, not to kachim. Now we learned that ochlam b'tumas atzmon loke, that if the Masechet or the Bikurim were makabel tuma, if you eat it, you get malchus for that. Masha enke b'truma, hochel truma tmeya, eno loke. So the Gemara says, milkahu delo loki ha'isura ika minolan. How do you know that Bechlal is an isur? They eat truma tmeya. Amar kra, in Psulei Mukdashim, we saw earlier, the Torah says, B'sharecha tochalena, hatar v'tome yachto, katzvi v'kayal. And we have Tana D'Vnei Rabbi Shmuel that the pasuk comes to teach us that even a tamei and a tar can eat on the same chulkan and kara achas from b'sar p'sulei mikdashim. And we're not choshesh that b'negias hatamei yitma basa, and they'll be eating p'sulei mikdashim shenitmu. But from the pasuk, the word tochlenu, we are medayik lozeh for p'sulei mikdashim. You're allowed to eat it in a case where nitma machal, the lowly acher, but not something else. What's this something else? This something else is peros truma shenitmu, and that's called the lav habamachal essay. The lav habamachal essay. So this is where we're going to stop for today. Up to Omar of Ashi on the bottom of Daf Ayin Gimel Amid Beis. So I wish you a great day. Thank you so much.